Okay, so the next story I would like to tell you about is not just one woman, but three women who traveled together. And they traveled together as Christian missionaries in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And their names are Evangeline French and her sister Francesca French and their friend Mildred Cable. And these three ladies, for various reasons, found themselves just not fitting in at all with society as they found it back home. Either they suffered from heartbreak or disappointment, or they just did not fit in with their family lives or with their social circle in the late 1800s. And so individually, they took themselves off to China and they became Christian missionaries, first of all in Shanghai, and then to various places further afield within China, but with the aim of actually going to remote communities across the Gobi Desert. So in other words, they were going to places which the China Inland Mission had not yet reached. So they were going to quite dangerous places at a very dangerous time, because this was at a time, especially in the late 1800s, where there were uprisings, there was a lot of discontent, and Christian missionaries, any kind of visitors, were viewed with suspicion, and it was a dangerous time for a lot of visitors throughout Asia. That we were finding that we find the same kind of stories all over the world. I've just been speaking about Isabella Bird. She has had the same experiences wherever she went. And these ladies, they were going with a very definite purpose. They were spreading the word of the Gospels, and they were also setting up little schools. They were setting up little education centres. I mean, really, fundamentally, they were trying to improve the living conditions and the health of a lot of the communities they went into. They weren't going with a preconceived judgment. That was the thing with these women. They were very humble. And they were also extremely talented because they spoke the languages of all the places they went to. They didn't just travel with an interpreter and expect somebody to do the work for them. They spoke the languages and they understood all the dialects. And quite often they would come up into a village and they would just settle down in one of the humble lodgings, and they would get talking to people. And any kind of distrust that they might have encountered initially just disappeared, because people found that they were very much the same. They had a lot of things in common. And so people were saying things like, well, just go and see these ladies because they're very much like us. They've got the same kind of standards. They've got the same, the same kind of, almost the same kind of life ethic, and they were very open-minded. So what these women were doing actually was taking themselves across the desert, and they weren't armed, they weren't carrying any weapons at all. They were basically just taking a mule and a cart and a load of Bibles and trying to spread a little bit of humanity, a little bit of peace, and to try and bring some kind of healing, I suppose, if you like, to some suffering that they found. And there were instances where they came across hostilities. It's quite difficult to tease out these stories from their books because they wrote it in such a way that they were almost seeing themselves in a kind of parable as traveling across the desert and encountering all these difficulties, almost as if it was a kind of spiritual journey for them, which it was. But what happened was that they were captured by a local warlord who had a terrifying reputation and imprisoned for quite a while. And they truly believed that they wouldn't get out of there. And they befriended somebody who was coming and going to the place where they were being held captive. He was almost like their kind of negotiator, as it were. And suddenly they found, for some unexplained reason, that they were going to be set free, which was contrary to all of their expectations, on the condition that they would just have one last audience with this fearsome warlord. So they went to see him. They were taken to see him in his beautiful room. And Mildred Cable, who was the most courageous of the three, and they were all very courageous, instead of basically just saying, well, thank you so much for our freedom, we're very grateful, she got hold of her copy of the Bible and she advanced on this warlord with her Bible and basically said something to the effect that you have a read of this, young man, it will do you good. And of course their two friends were sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, Mildred, not now. This is not the time. But he was so surprised, and I think maybe touched as well, because they had helped him. They'd helped him. I think they'd actually treated one of his wounds and he'd got better. So he did have a kind of a debt to them in that sense. And they were allowed to go free. And I think it's that courage, that courage that they found in such hugely challenging circumstances that really spoke to me. And they came to RSGS in 1943 and gave lectures about their experiences. And they also actually brought with them a young girl whom they'd rescued from one of the regions that they'd been visiting in China. And for various reasons, she'd been abandoned. I think she was homeless. She was an orphan, and these ladies had rescued her and given her a home back in Britain. And yes, so when they came to RSGS, they were given the Livingstone Medal in 1943, basically for their travels and for because they'd actually surveyed places that hadn't been mapped before. They'd found cave paintings. There was the caves of 1,000 Buddhas that they came across on the Silk Road, and there were some that had already been discovered, and there were some that had yet to be discovered. And these ladies visited the lesser known ones and described them in their books. So they had so many layers. You could actually see them as geographers in one respect, because they were traveling to new places and describing them. But they were also on a deeper level. They were they were spiritual travelers. They were going for the sake of themselves as well as the people that they were meeting. And it was really only old age that forced them, in a way, to come back to Britain, and they settled down and wrote books. So again, extremely inspirational women, very brave women, going to probably one of the most dangerous places of the world at that time, and just basically relying on their faith, nothing else, to get them through.